The marble floors of the mansion stretched endlessly, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Richard Thompson's footsteps echoed through the halls like a metronome counting down to nowhere. At 45, he moved through his own home like a stranger visiting a museum of his former life. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp shadows across the dining room where he sat alone. The table could seat 12, but Richard occupied only the head chair, the same spot he'd claimed every morning for the past 3 years. His breakfast, black coffee and untouched toast, grew cold as he stared at his phone, scrolling through hotel occupancy reports that blurred together into meaningless numbers. His reflection caught in the polished surface of the table. Grey had crept into his dark hair earlier than expected, settling at his temples like dust on forgotten furniture. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent reviewing contracts and quarterly projections, anything to avoid the silence that lived in the spaces between his responsibilities. The weight of expectation pressed against his shoulders. Thompson Hotels wasn't just a business. It was a legacy built by his father and grandfather, a monument to success that demanded constant vigilance. Every decision rippled through hundreds of employees, thousands of guests, millions in revenue. The numbers were clean, predictable. People were not. His phone buzzed. Another urgent message from his assistant about a board meeting. Richard's jaw tightened as he read the details. Budget cuts, staff reductions, efficiency improvements. Terms that sounded clinical but meant families losing their livelihoods. He'd learned to think in spreadsheets because spreadsheets didn't have faces. A photograph sat on the mantelpiece across the room, barely visible from where he sat. Sarah's smile, frozen in time, holding their infant son, Alex, at the hospital. Richard's throat constricted. She'd been the one who made decisions feel human, who reminded him that behind every number was a story worth preserving. Without her, he'd become what she'd always feared he might, a man who confused necessity with righteousness. The sound of a vacuum cleaner hummed from somewhere upstairs. Maria was already working, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency he'd come to depend on. In 2 years, she'd never asked for anything beyond her paycheck, never complained about the long hours or the weight of keeping his life organized. She simply existed in the background of his chaos, invisible and indispensable. Richard stood abruptly, abandoning his breakfast. The house felt smaller when he was still, when silence had space to expand. Movement was better. Movement meant purpose, even when the destination was just another empty room in an endless cycle of empty rooms. He paused at the bottom of the staircase, listening to the gentle rhythm of Maria's work above. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to live in a house that felt alive, where voices carried warmth instead of just sound. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it formed. He had a hotel empire to run, responsibilities that couldn't pause for longing. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, another day beginning exactly like the one before. Richard straightened his tie, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the front door, leaving behind the warmth of human presence for the cold certainty of corporate halls. Behind him, the house settled back into its familiar quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of someone who understood that some silences were too heavy for one person to carry alone. The boardroom windows reflected the Los Angeles skyline, a maze of glass and steel that mirrored the complexity of Richard's thoughts. 23 executives sat around the mahogany table, their faces a mixture of anticipation and carefully concealed anxiety. The quarterly report lay open before him, its pages filled with red ink that told a story nobody wanted to hear. Occupancy is down 12% across all properties. Richard's voice cut through the air with surgical precision. Labor costs continue to rise while guest satisfaction scores plateau. We need immediate action. His fingers traced the edge of the financial statements. Each line item represented a decision that would ripple through lives he'd never meet. Room service attendants, housekeepers, maintenance workers, people with families, mortgages, dreams that hinged on paychecks he was about to eliminate. The San Francisco property alone is hemorrhaging $40,000 monthly in overtime, continued Janet, his operations director. Her tone was clinical, detached. Numbers were easier when they didn't have names attached. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. Inside, something twisted. He remembered Sarah's voice from years ago, her hand gentle on his arm as she whispered about the cleaning lady at their first hotel who worked 3 jobs to support her children. Every person has a story, she'd said. Don't let the business make you forget that. But forgetting was exactly what survival demanded. Implement the reduction plan, Richard said finally. Effective immediately. 15% staff cuts across all departments. The room fell silent except for the scratch of pens on paper. Signatures that would end careers, alter trajectories, force families to recalculate their futures. Richard's pen felt heavier than usual as he signed his name at the bottom of the termination order. His phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Dad, can we talk tonight? It's important." Richard stared at the message, his son's words blurring with the financial projections spread across the table. Alex was 17 now, on the cusp of college applications and life-altering decisions. The weight of that responsibility felt different from the weight of business, more personal, more fragile, more likely to shatter if he handled it wrong. The meeting continued around him, voices discussing market strategies and competitive analysis. But Richard's mind drifted to the space between obligation and choice, between the man his father had raised him to be and the man Sarah had hoped he could become. The 2 versions existed in constant tension, each pulling him in directions that seemed mutually exclusive. "Richard!" Janet's voice snapped him back to the present. "The Miami expansion proposal needs your final approval." More numbers, more projections, more lives reduced to profit margins and risk assessments. Richard looked at the faces around the table, educated, well-compensated people who'd learned, like him, to view humanity through spreadsheets. When had caring become a liability instead of a strength? "Table it," he said abruptly. "I need more data." The executives exchanged glances. Richard Thompson didn't table decisions. He made them swiftly, definitively, without the luxury of second-guessing. But something in his voice suggested that today was different, that the machinery of corporate efficiency had hit an unexpected obstruction. The meeting ended with handshakes and forced smiles. Richard remained seated as the room emptied, staring at Alex's text message on his phone. His son wanted to talk, needed something from him that couldn't be solved with money or influence. The thought both terrified and intrigued him. Outside the windows, the sun was beginning its descent behind the city's geometric horizon. Soon he would return to his empty mansion, sit in his empty dining room, and pretend that the silence was a choice rather than a consequence. But first, he had to decide whether the man who'd signed those termination papers was the same one Alex needed as a father. The grandfather clock in the boardroom chimed 5 o'clock. Another day of calculated cruelty disguised as business acumen was ending. Richard gathered his papers, each page heavier than the last, and prepared to return home to a house that reflected exactly what he'd become. Impressive from a distance, but hollow at its core. The house greeted Richard with its familiar chill, marble floors stretching like frozen lakes beneath his feet. He loosened his tie as he climbed the staircase, each step echoing in the cavernous space that had once felt like home. Sarah's presence still lingered in the choice of paint colors, the arrangement of furniture, the way light fell through carefully selected curtains. But her warmth had died with her, leaving only the architecture of a life they'd planned together. Alex's bedroom door was closed, a thin line of light visible beneath. Richard paused outside, his hand hovering over the doorknob. How did a man who commanded boardrooms full of executives approach his own son? The termination papers he'd signed hours earlier seemed to mock him from his briefcase. If he could dismiss 63 employees without flinching, why did knocking on his son's door feel impossible? He retreated to his study instead, pouring himself a glass of whiskey that burned like regret. The walls were lined with awards, photographs from hotel openings, handshakes with politicians and celebrities. Evidence of a successful life that felt increasingly empty with each passing year. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him look up. Alex stood in the doorway, 17 and tall like his father, but with Sarah's gentle eyes and her way of seeing straight through pretense. His son had inherited the worst possible combination, Richard's stubborn independence and Sarah's emotional intelligence. "You missed dinner again," Alex said, not accusingly, just stating fact. "I was working, I know." Alex stepped into the room, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Dad, we need to talk about college applications. The deadlines are coming up." Richard set down his glass, grateful for concrete territory. College applications were logistics, timelines, problems with solutions. Harvard, Stanford, MIT. Your grades qualify you for any of them. I can make some calls. What if I don't want any of them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard studied his son's face, searching for signs of rebellion or teenage defiance. Instead, he found something that looked dangerously like his own trapped expression in boardroom mirrors. "Don't want them?" Richard repeated slowly. "Alex, these are opportunities most people would kill for. I know." Alex's voice carried a weariness that seemed too old for 17. "But what if I'm not most people? What if I want something different?" Richard felt the ground shifting beneath him, the same vertigo that struck when quarterly projections missed their marks. "Different how?" "I want to teach. Elementary school. Maybe middle school. I want to work with kids who need someone to believe in them." Alex's words came faster now, as if he'd been practicing this conversation. "I know it's not what you planned, not what the Thompson legacy looks like, but teaching?" The word escaped Richard's mouth like he'd tasted something bitter. "Alex, you have the potential to run companies, to build empires. Why would you waste that on—" He stopped himself, but too late. The damage was written across Alex's face, the same expression Sarah used to get when Richard's priorities showed their true colors. "On what, Dad? On helping people. On making a difference in someone's life instead of just making money." Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the day's decisions pressing against his skull. "It's not about money. It's about potential, about not limiting yourself to what you think I should be." Alex stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Dad, when was the last time you did something that made you actually happy? Not successful, not profitable, just happy?" The question struck like a physical blow. Richard looked at his son, really looked, and saw Sarah's compassion reflected in eyes that were beginning to harden with disappointment. When had Alex learned to look at him the way hotel staff did, with careful politeness masking something deeper and more painful? "Happiness is a luxury," Richard said finally, the words tasting like ash. "I have responsibilities. People depend on the decisions I make. People depend on teachers too," Alex replied, "but they depend on them to care, not just to profit." The silence that followed felt heavier than the house itself. Richard reached for his whiskey, then thought better of it. Outside, Los Angeles sparkled with a million lights, each one representing lives being lived with passion, purpose, connection, things that felt increasingly foreign to him. "We'll discuss this when you're thinking more clearly," Richard said, falling back on the executive tone that had ended countless uncomfortable conversations. Alex's shoulders sagged. "When I'm thinking like you want me to think, you mean? When you understand what's at stake?" Alex turned toward the door, then paused. "Mom would have understood," he said quietly. "She would have asked me what made me feel alive, not what made business sense. After Alex left, Richard sat alone in his study, surrounded by the monuments to his success. The whiskey burned less now, or maybe he was just getting numb. Outside, the city continued its restless dance of ambition and dreams, while inside his mansion, a father and son grew further apart with each passing day. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another day where Richard had chosen duty over love, strategy over humanity. The pattern felt as fixed as the marble beneath his feet, as unchangeable as the empty rooms that echoed with everything he'd lost. Maria Gonzalez arrived at the mansion before sunrise, as she had every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years. Her beat-up Honda Civic looked out of place against the pristine circular driveway, but she'd learned to park behind the service entrance where it wouldn't offend the neighborhood's aesthetic sensibilities. At 30, she moved with the efficient grace of someone who understood that time was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her cleaning supplies rattled softly in the canvas bag, slung over her shoulder as she used her key to enter through the back door. The kitchen welcomed her with its cold perfection, granite counters that gleamed like mirrors, appliances that cost more than she made in 6 months, a breakfast nook where no one ever shared a meal. She'd grown accustomed to the emptiness, the way silence seemed to pool in the corners like dust. The house revealed its secrets gradually. Richard's untouched breakfast from the morning before, Alex's textbooks scattered across the dining room table, abandoned mid-study session, a wine glass with lipstick stains that had been sitting on the coffee table for 3 days, evidence of solitary evenings spent medicating against loneliness. Maria worked methodically, room by room, erasing the small signs of lives being lived without joy. She developed her own rhythm, her own way of moving through other people's spaces without leaving traces of herself behind. It was a skill born of necessity, refined by years of being invisible to those who employed her. But this house was different. In other homes, she cleaned around happiness, family photos, children's artwork, evidence of celebration and connection. Here, she cleaned around absences. The dining room that seated 12 but fed only 1. The game room where no games were played. The family room where no family gathered. As she dusted Richard's study, Maria's eyes lingered on a photograph partially hidden behind a stack of legal documents. A woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, holding a baby. She'd seen the photo countless times, but never moved it, understanding instinctively that some things were sacred, even in their abandonment. A sound from upstairs made her pause. Footsteps, then voices. Richard and Alex, their conversation muffled, but tense. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was familiar. She'd heard it in her own mother's voice years ago, the strain of love complicated by disappointment and misunderstanding. Maria continued her work, invisible as always, but aware of the fractures that ran through this beautiful, broken house. She thought of her own children waiting for her at home. Sophia, 8, with her mother's intuition and stubborn independence. The twins, Miguel and Carlos, 5 years old and still young enough to believe that love could solve any problem. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in East LA, where the walls were thin and the neighbors were close, where children's laughter mixed with the sound of traffic and life happened in full color rather than muted tones. It wasn't much, but it was filled with the kind of warmth that no amount of money could buy. The morning stretched on. Richard left for the office with his usual brisk efficiency, barely acknowledging her presence with a curt nod. Alex disappeared into his room, music bleeding through the closed door, something sad and searching that made Maria's chest tight with recognition. By noon, the house gleamed with artificial perfection. Every surface reflected light that seemed to have nowhere warm to land. Maria gathered her supplies, checking her phone for messages from her babysitter. Sophia had a science project due tomorrow, and the twins needed help with their reading homework. Her real life was waiting, but as she prepared to leave, something made her pause at the bottom of the staircase. The house felt heavier today, as if the weight of unspoken words and missed connections was finally becoming too much for even its grand architecture to bear. She thought about Richard's face that morning, the way exhaustion had settled into lines around his eyes. She thought about Alex's music, melancholy and young and searching for something his father couldn't provide. In her own small apartment, her children would already be anticipating her return, their faces brightening when she walked through the door. Some people, Maria realized, lived in palaces but had never learned how to come home. She locked the back door carefully behind her and walked to her car, carrying with her the strange sadness that seemed to seep from the mansion's walls. Tonight, she would help Sophia with her science project and read bedtime stories to the twins, and for a few hours, she would forget about the beautiful emptiness she'd left behind. But tomorrow, she would return, and the emptiness would still be waiting. Maria's apartment building stood like a weathered sentinel against the Los Angeles morning sky, its stucco walls painted a faded yellow that had once been cheerful. The parking lot was a patchwork of oil stains and cracked asphalt, where her Honda sat among other vehicles that had seen better decades. But inside apartment 2B, warmth radiated from every corner like sunlight through worn curtains. "Mummy!" Sophia's voice carried from the kitchen, where she stood on a step stool stirring scrambled eggs with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with important work. At 8, she had inherited Maria's intuitive understanding of what needed to be done, her dark eyes always watching, always calculating how to help. The twins tumbled out of their shared bedroom like puppies, Miguel clutching a picture book while Carlos dragged a stuffed elephant that had lost most of its fur to years of devoted love. They threw themselves at Maria's legs with the casual assumption that she would always be there to catch them. "Tell us about the castle," Carlos demanded, his arms wrapped around her waist. "It's not a castle, mijo," Sophia corrected with 8-year-old authority. "It's a mansion." "Castles have knights." "Does it have knights?" Miguel asked hopefully, pressing his face against Maria's hip. Maria lifted both boys, one in each arm, marveling as always at their ability to make her feel strong even when exhaustion pulled at her bones. "No knights," she said, settling onto the couch that served as living room furniture, homework desk, and storytelling stage. "But it has very tall windows and rooms bigger than our whole apartment. Do rich people play different games?" Carlos wanted to know. The question caught Maria off guard. She thought of Alex's untouched gaming systems, Richard's study filled with awards, but no laughter, the dining room that could host a party, but never did. "I think they forget how to play sometimes," she said carefully. Sophia appeared beside them, having turned off the stove with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd learned early that safety was everyone's responsibility. "Maybe they need someone to teach them," she suggested, settling against Maria's side with the natural gravity that drew her family together. "Maybe they do," Maria murmured, stroking Sophia's hair. The morning unfolded with the comfortable chaos of a family that had learned to function as a unit. Sophia helped the twins with their clothes, while Maria braided hair and packed lunches from groceries stretched to cover 5 days instead of 3. Their routine was choreographed by necessity, each person playing their part in the dance of making ends meet. But today felt different. As Maria waited for the school bus with her children, watching Sophia help Miguel tie his shoes while Carlos practiced reading aloud from his book, she found herself thinking about another child entirely. Alex, alone in his expensive bedroom, surrounded by opportunities his father had chosen for him, but lacking the one thing her children took for granted, the unshakable knowledge that they were loved not for what they achieved, but simply for who they were. "Mummy?" Sophia's voice pulled her back. "You're thinking about the sad house again." Maria blinked, surprised by her daughter's perception. "How do you know?" "You get quiet. Like when you're trying to solve a problem that's too big for just you." Sophia's eyes, wise beyond her years, searched her mother's face. "Is someone there hurting?" Before Maria could answer, the school bus arrived with its familiar rumble and squeak of brakes. She kissed each child goodbye, watching them climb the steps with backpacks almost as big as they were, their voices bright with anticipation for the day ahead. Miguel turned at the bus window to wave, his gap-toothed grin infectious even through the glass. Alone on the sidewalk, Maria felt the weight of Sophia's question. Yes, someone was hurting. Several someones, in fact, living in a house that had everything except what mattered most. But what could she do? She was just the cleaning lady, invisible and interchangeable, paid to maintain surfaces while the deeper damage went untended. Her phone buzzed with a text from her babysitter, Mrs. Chen, from downstairs. "Take your time today, mija. The little ones can come to me after school." The unexpected gift of time made Maria pause. Usually, she rushed through her work at the mansion, conscious of every minute away from her children. But today stretched before her with unusual possibility. Maybe she could linger, could pay attention to things she usually ignored in her hurry to get home. As she drove toward the mansion, Maria found herself wondering what Sophia would do in her place. Her 8-year-old daughter had never met a problem she didn't think could be solved with enough love and attention. It was a luxury of childhood, perhaps, but also a wisdom that adults often forgot in their rush toward more complicated solutions. The mansion appeared through the morning haze, its windows reflecting the sky like empty eyes. But for the first time in 2 years, Maria approached it with something other than resignation. She thought of her children's easy affection, their instinct to comfort and include, their belief that loneliness was just a temporary problem waiting for the right person to notice. Maybe, she thought as she parked behind the service entrance, it was time to stop being invisible. The mansion was different that morning. Even before Maria stepped through the back entrance, she sensed something had shifted in the careful order she'd grown accustomed to maintaining. Glass crunched under her feet in the hallway, fragments from what had been a crystal vase, now scattered like frozen tears across the polished floor. Tables were overturned in the living room. Books lay splayed across the carpet, their pages bent and torn. Cushions had been thrown from the sofa, and a lampshade sat askew, casting strange shadows across the wall. It looked like the aftermath of a storm that had blown through with targeted fury, destroying beauty without purpose. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was to call the police, then Richard, then someone who could make sense of what she was seeing. But as she moved deeper into the chaos, details emerged that suggested something more complicated than a break-in. The expensive electronics remained untouched. Jewelry glittered undisturbed in an open drawer. Whatever had happened here wasn't about theft. Muddy footprints led from the French doors toward the back of the house, each print growing fainter as they approached the basement stairs. Maria followed them with growing dread, her cleaning supplies forgotten by the kitchen door. The basement was Richard's private domain, his wine cellar, storage room, a place she'd been instructed never to enter. But the footprints led downward, and something in their desperate pattern made her abandon protocol. The basement was dimmer, cooler, filled with the earthy smell of wine aging in wooden barrels. But there was something else, the sharp, metallic scent of blood, and underneath it the quick, frightened breathing of someone trying very hard not to be found. "Hello?" Maria called softly. "If someone's hurt, I want to help." A rustling sound came from behind a rack of wine bottles. Maria approached slowly, the way she would approach one of her twins after a nightmare, projecting calm even as her pulse raced. In the shadow between two barrels, she found him. Alex sat huddled against the wall, his school uniform torn and dirty, his face pale except for a bruise blooming purple across his left cheek. Blood had dried around a cut on his lip, and his hand shook as he tried to wipe dirt from his clothes, with movements that spoke of shock more than vanity. "Oh, mijo," Maria breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. The word escaped before she could stop it, the same endearment she used for her own children, automatic as breathing. Alex looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than 17, red-rimmed and hollow. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "If my dad finds out I came back—" Maria reached out slowly, the way she would to an injured animal, letting Alex see her hands before they touched him. His forehead was warm, possibly fevered, and he flinched when her fingers brushed the bruise on his cheek. "What happened to you?" "We had a fight last night. About college, about everything." Alex's voice cracked like ice over deep water. "He said I was ungrateful, that I didn't understand sacrifice. I said he didn't understand anything except money. And then He gestured helplessly at his torn clothes, his bloodied face. "I ran. I've been walking all night, but I couldn't think of anywhere else to go." Maria's chest tightened. She thought of Sophia's question that morning, "Is someone there hurting?" and realized she was looking at the answer. This boy, surrounded by wealth and privilege, was as lost as any child she'd ever seen. "Your father doesn't know you're here?" Alex shook his head. "He thinks I'm at school. I couldn't face him this morning. I couldn't pretend everything was normal when nothing feels normal anymore." His hands clenched into fists. "I destroyed the living room when I came in. I was so angry, and I couldn't stop myself." Maria nodded, understanding flooding through her. She'd seen this kind of desperation in her own life. The moment when holding everything inside became impossible, when rage and hurt had to go somewhere, or they'd consume everything from within. "Come on," she said gently, offering him her hand. "Let's get you cleaned up." Alex hesitated. "Maria, that's your name, right? My dad's told me about you, how you keep everything running. I don't want to get you in trouble." "My job is to take care of this house," Maria said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "That includes everyone in it." Something in her tone seemed to reach him. Alex took her offered hand, letting her help him to his feet. He was taller than she'd expected, almost a man, but still carrying the uncertain grace of adolescence. As they climbed the basement stairs together, Maria found herself thinking not of consequences or protocols, but of her own children. How Miguel curled against her when thunderstorms scared him, how Carlos sought comfort in her arms when the world felt too big and confusing. This boy needed the same thing her children did, someone to see his pain and choose tenderness over judgment. The fact that he was rich, that his father employed her, that helping him might cost her the job she desperately needed, none of that mattered in the face of such raw, obvious hurt. In the kitchen, Maria wet a clean towel and gently cleaned the blood from Alex's face, while he sat docile as a child, letting her tend to wounds that went far deeper than his bruised cheek. Through the window, Los Angeles stretched endlessly, full of families navigating the complicated dance of love and misunderstanding. "Better?" she asked, when she'd done what she could. Alex nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "I didn't know anyone would care enough to—" "Everyone deserves to be cared for," Maria interrupted softly, "especially when they're hurting." Outside, a car door slammed. Richard, home unexpectedly early. Maria's blood turned to ice as she realized what this looked like: the destroyed living room, Alex's injuries, her presence in a situation that defied every boundary her employment had established. But as footsteps approached the kitchen door, Maria made a choice that surprised even her. Instead of stepping away from Alex, she moved closer, placing herself between him and whatever storm was about to break through that door. Richard's face went through a series of transformations as he took in the scene. The destroyed living room visible through the doorway, his son's bruised face, Maria standing protectively between them, like a shield made of determination and defiance. For a moment, no one spoke. The kitchen filled with a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls. "What the hell happened here?" Richard's voice was barely controlled, each word sharp enough to cut. Alex straightened in his chair, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. "Dad, I can explain. Can you?" Richard's eyes swept over the damage visible beyond the kitchen. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've destroyed my home and—" His gaze settled on Maria with cold calculation. "And somehow involved my employee in whatever tantrum you decided to throw." Maria felt Alex tense beside her. She could sense his impulse to flee, to run again rather than face the storm brewing in his father's eyes. But running had brought him here, broken and bleeding. Sometimes the only way through was forward. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. Alex was hurt. He needed help. "Hurt?" Richard stepped closer, and Maria caught the scent of his cologne, mixed with something sharper, fear disguised as anger. "He looks fine to me. Guilty, but fine." "He spent the night on the streets," Maria continued, placing a gentle hand on Alex's shoulder when he started to speak. "He was bleeding when I found him. You couldn't just do your job." Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "You couldn't just clean what needed cleaning and leave family matters to family." The words hit Maria like a slap. She felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her function, reminded of her place in the careful hierarchy that governed houses like this. But then she looked at Alex's face, pale, frightened, young, and something inside her refused to step back. "With respect, Mr. Thompson, your son was hiding in your basement, hurt and afraid. I don't know what job description covers ignoring a child in pain, but it's not mine." Richard's eyes widened at her audacity. In 2 years of employment, Maria had never spoken to him with anything other than deferential politeness. Her direct challenge seemed to catch him off guard, as if she'd suddenly become visible in a way that complicated his understanding of the world's natural order. "Alex," Richard said, his voice tight with control, "go to your room. We'll discuss this when I've dealt with—" He gestured vaguely at Maria, as if she were part of the debris that needed clearing. "No." Alex's voice was quiet but firm. He stood slowly, his hand finding Maria's in a gesture that felt both grateful and protective. "Don't blame her for helping me. She did what you should have done." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything. Richard's face cycled through emotions: anger, hurt, recognition, denial, before settling into the mask of corporate authority he wore when difficult decisions needed making. "Maria," he said finally, his tone formal and distant, "I think it's best if you collect your things and leave. I'll have your final paycheck sent to you." The words landed with the weight of inevitability. Maria had known this moment might come from the instant she'd chosen to help Alex rather than call his father. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The job had been more than income. It had been stability, routine, the foundation on which her family's life was built. "Dad, no!" Alex stepped forward, his young face fierce with indignation. "She helped me. She was kind to me. You can't fire her for—" "I can fire her for whatever reason I choose," Richard replied, but something in his voice had changed. The absolute certainty was cracking, letting through traces of the man who remembered what kindness looked like. "Alex, you don't understand the position this puts me in. The liability, the what?" Maria found herself asking. "The liability of having an employee who cares about your son's safety? The risk of someone in your house acting like family matters?" Richard turned to her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been respect. "You have children of your own to worry about," he said, and for the first time his voice carried acknowledgement that she existed beyond her function. "You can't afford to risk your job for someone else's family problems." "You're right," Maria said quietly. "I can't afford to lose this job. My children depend on the money I make here. But they also depend on having a mother who teaches them that doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing." She looked at Alex, seeing in his bruised face echoes of her own children when they needed comfort more than correction. "Your son was hurt and alone. In my world, that means you help first and worry about consequences later." Richard's jaw worked silently. Maria could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the businessman who needed clean boundaries fighting against the father who recognized his own failure reflected in his employees' courage. "I'll pack my supplies," Maria said when the silence stretched too long. She squeezed Alex's hand gently, wanting him to understand that his worth wasn't tied to what happened next. "Take care of yourself, mijo." She moved toward the door, carrying herself with dignity that had nothing to do with the money in her bank account. But Alex's voice stopped her. "Maria, wait." He turned to his father with a combination of desperation and determination that reminded Richard painfully of Sarah. "Dad, please. She's the only person in this house who's shown me what caring looks like. Don't punish her for being what we forgot how to be." The truth of it hit Richard like a physical blow. In the space between his son's words and Maria's quiet dignity, he caught a glimpse of the man he'd become, someone who fired people for acts of human decency, who had taught his son that love was conditional on compliance with corporate values. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon, marking another moment when Richard Thompson would have to choose between the safe path and the right one. 3 days passed, like a held breath. Maria's apartment felt smaller somehow, crowded with worry that had nowhere to go. She sat at her kitchen table surrounded by job applications and rejection letters. The math of her diminished circumstances spread across the surface like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. Sophia noticed first, the way children always do. She appeared beside Maria's chair with the silent gravity of someone who understood that adult problems required careful navigation. "Mummy, why aren't you going to the sad house anymore?" "I don't work there anymore, mi amor." Maria pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and innocence. "Sometimes jobs end, and we have to find new ones." "Did you get fired for helping someone?" Sophia's question was asked with the matter-of-fact clarity that made Maria's chest tight. Before she could answer, her phone rang. Alex's name appeared on the screen, and Maria hesitated. Taking his call felt like opening a door she'd worked hard to close, but the ringing persisted with an urgency that suggested desperation rather than casual conversation. "Maria?" Alex's voice was rough, exhausted. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call." "What's wrong?" Maria moved to the window, looking out at the courtyard where Miguel and Carlos played soccer with a ball that had seen better years. "I think I'm sick, really sick. And my dad's in San Francisco for business and his voice broke slightly. "I can't stop shaking and everything feels wrong. I know I don't have the right to ask, but would you? Where are you?" "At home. I mean at the house. I've been too dizzy to drive anywhere." Maria closed her eyes, feeling the familiar pull between self-preservation and the instinct to help. Alex wasn't her responsibility anymore. She owed the Thompson family nothing except the resentment of unemployment and financial uncertainty, but she could hear genuine fear in his voice, the vulnerability of someone young and alone and frightened. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. The mansion looked different from the outside, as if her firing had altered her relationship to its architecture. She no longer had keys, no longer belonged in its carefully maintained spaces. But Alex was waiting by the back door, pale and unsteady, his usual composure replaced by the fragile transparency of illness. "Thank you for coming," he said, as she helped him back to the kitchen. "I know you didn't have to." Maria guided him to a chair and pressed her palm against his forehead. The fever was unmistakable, burning through his skin with an intensity that sent alarm bells through her maternal instincts. "How long have you been feeling like this?" "Since yesterday morning, maybe the morning before. Time's been weird." Alex's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water, and Maria noticed the way his breathing seemed labored, urgent. She knelt beside his chair, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd nursed 3 children through countless illnesses. But this felt different, more serious. The kind of sick that required medical attention rather than home remedies. "Alex, when did you last eat?" He looked confused by the question. I'm not sure. Food makes me feel worse." "And when did you last take your medication?" "Medication?" His confusion deepened, and Maria felt cold understanding settle in her stomach. "For your diabetes. Your insulin." Alex stared at her as if she was speaking a foreign language. "I don't have diabetes." The words hit Maria like ice water. She thought of her cousin Luis, the way he'd looked in the hospital when his blood sugar spiked beyond control. The confusion, the dehydration, the rapid breathing, all the signs that Alex was displaying with frightening clarity. "Mijo," she said gently, taking his hands in hers, "I think we need to get you to a hospital, right now." Fear flickered across his features. "No, I can't. My dad will kill me if I end up in the emergency room while he's away. He'll think I'm being dramatic, trying to get attention." "Alex, listen to me." Maria's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years keeping children safe. "This isn't about attention or drama. Your body is telling us something important, and we need to listen." She thought of her own children, safe with Mrs. Chen, but expecting her home by dinner. She thought of Richard, somewhere in San Francisco, making business deals, while his son sat in an empty house, too sick to think clearly and too afraid of disappointment to ask for help. She thought of the job she'd lost for caring too much and the bills that were mounting in her absence. None of it mattered as much as the frightened boy in front of her. "I'm taking you to the hospital," she said firmly. "And I'm calling your father." "Maria, no." "Yes." She was already reaching for her phone, her mind shifting into crisis mode. "Some things are more important than being in trouble. Your health is one of them." As she dialed Richard's number, Maria caught sight of their reflection in the kitchen window. A fired employee and her former boss's son, bound together by circumstance and the simple recognition that some responsibilities transcended employment contracts. The phone rang once, twice. When Richard's voice came through the speaker, professional and distant, Maria took a breath and prepared to bridge the gap between his corporate world and his son's immediate need for a father who could choose love over fear of complication. The hospital emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos, nurses moving with practiced urgency, monitors beeping their electronic rhythms, the constant shuffle of people navigating crisis. Maria sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, still wearing the clothes she'd thrown on hours earlier, when Alex's condition had deteriorated beyond home remedies. The diagnosis had come swiftly once the doctors ran their tests. Type 1 diabetes, severe diabetic ketoacidosis, blood sugar levels that should have been lethal. Alex was stable now, connected to IV lines and monitors in a room down the hall. But the near miss lingered in Maria's chest like a physical weight. "Mrs. Gonzalez?" A social worker approached with a clipboard and the careful expression of someone trained to deliver difficult information gently. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I need to ask you some questions about Alex Thompson." Maria nodded, though the title felt wrong. She wasn't Mrs. anything anymore, and her connection to Alex existed in the grey area between employment and something more complicated. "Is he going to be okay?" "He should recover fully, but this was serious. Another few hours." Sarah left the sentence unfinished. "You said you're the family's housekeeper?" "I was. I was fired 3 days ago." The words tasted bitter, but Maria had learned that honesty was simpler than explanations that required justifying her presence in situations where she no longer officially belonged. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "But you brought him to the hospital anyway." "He called me. He was scared and sick and alone." Maria straightened, meeting the social worker's gaze directly. "His father is in San Francisco on business. And you reached out to Mr. Thompson?" Maria nodded, remembering the phone call that had shattered Richard's professional composure like glass hitting concrete. His voice had gone from irritated impatience to raw panic in the space of a heartbeat when she'd explained where they were and why. The last she'd heard, he was fighting to get on the earliest flight home. This condition, Sarah continued carefully, it's not something that develops overnight. Alex has probably been experiencing symptoms for weeks, maybe months: extreme thirst, frequent urination, unexplained weight loss, fatigue. Did you notice any of these signs? Maria thought back to the mornings at the mansion, Alex's multiple water bottles, his increasing thinness beneath expensive clothes, the way he'd seemed exhausted even after full nights of sleep. Signs she'd attributed to teenage stress rather than medical crisis. I should have seen it, she said quietly. I clean his room. I see the water glasses, the way his clothes fit differently. I should have known something was wrong. You're not medically trained, Sarah reminded her gently, and you're not his parent. The fact that you recognized a crisis situation and acted appropriately probably saved his life. The words should have been comforting, but Maria felt only the weight of all she hadn't done, all the signs she'd missed while navigating the careful boundaries of her employment. How many mornings had she cleaned around evidence of Alex's deteriorating health without connecting the dots? There's another issue we need to discuss, Sarah continued. Alex is 17, which means he's a minor, but he's been managing a serious medical condition without parental awareness. That raises some questions about oversight and communication in the household. Before Maria could respond, commotion erupted near the emergency room entrance. Richard's voice carried over the ambient noise, urgent, demanding, barely contained. He appeared in the waiting area like a storm front, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his usually perfect hair disheveled. Where is he? Richard's eyes found Maria immediately, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his controlled features. Raw, undisguised terror. Is he? How bad is it? He's stable, Maria said quickly, standing to face him. The doctors say he'll recover completely, but diabetic ketoacidosis, Sarah interjected, introducing herself with professional calm. Mr. Thompson, your son has type 1 diabetes. This was a severe episode that could have been fatal without intervention. Richard's face went through a series of changes as the information processed. Diabetes? That's impossible. He would have told me. We would have known. Actually, Sarah said gently, it's not uncommon for adolescents to hide symptoms, especially if they're afraid of disappointing parents or being seen as weak. The implication hit Richard like a physical blow. Maria watched him absorb it, the realization that his son had been seriously ill for weeks while Richard focused on quarterly reports and expansion plans. That Alex had been so afraid of his father's reaction that he'd risked his life rather than admit vulnerability. I want to see him, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, but first, I need to understand how this situation developed. Alex was alone for several days while you were traveling, and his condition deteriorated to the point where he called. Sarah looked at Maria questioningly. Maria, she supplied. I used to work for the family. Used to? Richard's jaw tightened. I terminated her employment earlier this week due to a disagreement about boundaries. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, but Maria could see her calculating the dynamics: a sick teenager, an absent father, a former employee who'd been fired for caring too much. Well, Sarah said finally, it's fortunate that Alex felt comfortable reaching out to someone when he needed help. Mrs. Gonzalez, the attending physician, would like to speak with you about the symptoms you observed. Your information could be crucial for his ongoing care. As they walked toward Alex's room, Richard fell into step beside Maria. Thank you, he said quietly, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. For bringing him here, for seeing what I missed. Maria nodded but didn't trust herself to speak. Through the window of Alex's room, she could see him connected to monitors and IV lines, young and fragile and alive, the boy who'd called her when he was scared. The son, whose father was finally learning that some kinds of success couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. "Mr. Thompson?" Sarah paused at the door. "Before we go in, you should know that Alex has been asking for Maria. He wants to make sure she's not in trouble for helping him." Richard's face crumpled slightly. Here was the final devastating piece of evidence. His son, fighting for his life, worried about protecting the person who'd saved him from the consequences of her compassion. 3 weeks later, Richard sat across from Maria in a coffee shop in East LA, surrounded by the sounds of real life. Spanish conversations mixing with English, children laughing at nearby tables, the hiss and grind of an espresso machine operated by someone who knew every customer's name. It was a world away from the sterile conference rooms where he usually conducted business, and the contrast wasn't lost on him. Maria stirred her café con leche slowly, her eyes wary despite his request for this meeting. She'd agreed to see him, but her posture suggested someone prepared to defend herself against whatever corporate efficiency had brought him to her neighborhood. "How is Alex?" she asked, cutting through his rehearsed opening. "Better. Learning to manage his blood sugar levels. The doctors say he's responding well to treatment." Richard paused, watching her face soften with genuine relief. "He asks about you constantly, about your children. He wants to know if Sophia finished her science project." Maria's smile was small but real. "She did. Got an A+. She built a volcano that actually erupted. He'd like to hear about that, if you're willing to tell him." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Maria, I owe you more than an apology. You saved my son's life. I did what anyone would do." "No," Richard said firmly. "You did what I should have done. You saw that he was in trouble, and you acted. You risked your livelihood to help him, and when he got sick you were there because you cared about him as a person, not as an obligation." Maria set down her cup carefully. "Mr. Thompson, if you're here to offer me my job back out of guilt, I'm here to offer you a different job entirely." Richard pulled out a folder he'd brought but didn't open it yet. "But first, I need to tell you something that I've never told anyone outside of a therapist's office." He took a breath, feeling exposed in a way that boardrooms had never prepared him for. "The night Alex got sick, when you called me from the hospital, I was in a meeting about acquiring a chain of boutique hotels. I was focused on profit margins and market penetration, while my son was literally dying 20 miles away." Maria's expression softened slightly, but she remained quiet, letting him find his words. "I've spent the last 3 years running from the fact that I failed Sarah when she was dying. She asked me to promise that I'd raise Alex with love instead of expectation, with presence instead of just provision, and I've done the exact opposite." Richard's voice caught slightly. "I've raised him the way my father raised me, with conditions and standards and the constant message that love is something you earn rather than something you deserve." A family at the next table burst into laughter over something one of their children had said. The sound was warm, natural, the kind of joy that had been absent from Richard's house for so long he'd forgotten what it sounded like. "When I saw you in that hospital," he continued, "taking care of Alex like he was your own child, staying with him even though you had every reason to walk away, I realized something. You were being the parent I should have been. You were showing him the kind of unconditional care that I'd convinced myself was impractical." Maria's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "Your son loves you, Mr. Thompson. He's angry and hurt, but he loves you. That's why losing your approval scares him so much. I know. And that's why I need to change everything." Richard opened the folder and slid a paper across the table. "This is an offer to be the family manager for the Thompson household. Not housekeeper, family manager. Your salary would be doubled, with full health benefits for you and your children. Flexible hours that work around your school schedule because Alex told me you're planning to return to university. Maria stared at the paper, her expression unreadable. "I don't understand. Alex is going to need support managing his diabetes. I'm going to need help learning how to be a father instead of just a provider. And honestly, that house needs to feel like a home again instead of a museum." Richard paused. "Your children would be welcome any time. The house has a pool, a game room, a yard bigger than most parks. Alex has already asked if the twins might want to come swimming." "You want to hire me to humanize your family?" Maria's tone was careful, probing. "I want to hire you to teach us how to be a family. I want Alex to have the kind of stability and warmth I see when you talk about your children. I want to learn how to care about people the way you do, naturally, without calculating the cost." Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to determine whether this was genuine transformation or corporate manipulation disguised as vulnerability. "There's one condition," she said finally. "Name it. I won't be invisible anymore. If you hire me as family manager, that means I'm part of your family's life in a real way. I get a voice when Alex needs something you don't want to give him. I get to speak up when I see something that isn't working. And if you ever try to fire me again for caring too much, I'll walk away and take my opinions with me." Richard felt something shift in his chest. Relief mixed with the terrifying freedom of surrendering control to someone who might actually know better than he did. "Deal," he said, extending his hand across the table. "But I have one condition too." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Stop calling me Mr. Thompson. If we're going to be family, it's Richard." As they shook hands, Richard felt the weight of his isolation beginning to lift. For the first time in 3 years, he was choosing connection over control, trusting someone else to help him become the man Sarah had believed he could be. Outside the coffee shop window, Los Angeles bustled with its usual energy. But inside, two people from different worlds had just agreed to build something neither could create alone, a family born not from blood or obligation, but from the simple recognition that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and loved without conditions. The mansion felt different with children's voices echoing through its halls. Miguel and Carlos had transformed the sterile game room into a fortress of couch cushions and blankets, their laughter bouncing off marble floors that had forgotten what joy sounded like. Sophia sat at the kitchen island doing homework, her tongue poking out in concentration, while Alex helped her with fractions, his own textbooks abandoned in favor of being the big brother he'd never had the chance to be. Maria moved through the house with new confidence, her family's presence giving weight to her role that no salary increase could match. She'd been back for a month now, and the changes were subtle but profound. Fresh flowers appeared in rooms that had been showcases rather than living spaces. The dining room hosted actual meals where conversation mattered more than proper etiquette. Richard arrived home from the office to find chaos in his kitchen. Flour everywhere, 3 children covered in what appeared to be chocolate, and Alex standing guard over a cake that looked more like modern art than dessert. 6 months ago, the mess would have triggered his need for control. Now he loosened his tie and asked if he could help. "It's supposed to be a surprise," Carlos announced, chocolate smeared across his cheek like war paint. "For your birthday tomorrow." Richard had forgotten his own birthday, the way he'd forgotten most celebrations since Sarah died. But here were children who barely knew him, planning to mark the day with cake and chaos, treating him like family rather than an authority figure to be feared. "Can I test the frosting?" he asked seriously, earning delighted giggles from the twins. Maria watched from the doorway, dish towel in hand, as Richard tasted chocolate from Miguel's finger and declared it perfect. The transformation wasn't complete. She could still see the corporate executive in the way he straightened his shoulders, the careful control he maintained even in moments of spontaneity. But something fundamental had shifted. He was trying, genuinely trying, to become someone worthy of the love being offered so freely. Alex caught her eye and smiled. His diabetes was well managed now, his blood sugar monitored with the same precision Richard brought to quarterly reports. But more importantly, father and son were learning to talk to each other without the weight of impossible expectations crushing every conversation. "Maria," Richard said, noticing her observation, "join us. This cake needs professional supervision." She stepped into the kitchen, her kitchen now, and felt the rightness of belonging somewhere she was valued rather than just employed. Sophia immediately claimed her attention, explaining the science project that had evolved from volcano to solar system, her excitement infectious and pure. Later that evening, after the children were settled with a movie, and Alex had checked his blood sugar one final time, Maria found Richard on the back patio, looking out at the garden where security lights illuminated perfectly maintained flower beds. "Regrets?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Richard considered the question seriously. "About bringing your family here? None. About taking so long to understand what I was missing every day." Inside the house, Carlos's laughter carried through the French doors, followed by Sophia shushing him with 8-year-old authority, the sounds of a family learning to be comfortable with each other, to take up space without apology. "Your sister called today," Maria said carefully. "Veronica. She wanted to schedule a meeting about family business." Richard's expression hardened slightly. His relationship with Veronica had been strained since childhood, complicated by competition and resentment that had only deepened as adults. "What did you tell her?" "That family meetings happen here now, in the kitchen, over dinner. If she wants to discuss business, she can join us for Tuesday night tacos." Richard laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent as the house filled with reasons for joy. "She'll hate that." "Good," Maria said simply. "People who can't handle children and chaos don't belong in family decisions anyway." Through the window, they could see Alex helping Sophia with her reading, while the twins built another architectural marvel from throw pillows. "A family born from crisis and choice rather than blood and obligation, held together by the radical decision to love without conditions." Tomorrow, Richard would blow out birthday candles surrounded by children who had claimed him as their own, and for the first time in years he would make a wish that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. Veronica Thompson arrived at the mansion like winter, dressed in Chanel, her heels clicking against the marble with predatory precision. She moved through the house with the entitled familiarity of someone who'd grown up in its halls, but her expression suggested distaste for the changes she encountered. Children's artwork displayed alongside expensive paintings, toys organized in baskets that had once held purely decorative objects. Maria answered the door, with Flower still dusting her apron, having left Sophia and the twins making cookies with Alex in the kitchen. Veronica's gaze swept over her with the calculating coldness of someone accustomed to categorizing people by their usefulness. "You must be the housekeeper," Veronica said, stepping inside without invitation. "I'm here to see my brother. Family business." "I'm Maria, the family manager," Maria corrected quietly. "Richard is in his study with Alex, working on college applications." Something in Veronica's expression sharpened. "College applications? I thought Alex was having his little rebellion phase about wanting to teach instead of pursuing a real career." Maria felt protective instincts flare, the same fierce loyalty that rose when anyone threatened her own children. "Alex is applying to education programs. Richard is supporting his choices." "How progressive." Veronica's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Though I suppose it's easier to be supportive when someone else is handling the practical concerns." Before Maria could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway with Alex beside him. Father and son moved with an ease that had been impossible months earlier, Alex's hand resting briefly on Richard's shoulder as they entered the foyer together. "Veronica." Richard's voice carried cool politeness rather than warmth. "I wasn't expecting you." Clearly, Veronica's gaze took in the transformed atmosphere, the evidence of children living freely in spaces that had once been pristine showcases. "We need to discuss the hotel expansion. The board is asking questions about your recent distractions." Distractions? Alex stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying a protective edge that surprised everyone. "You mean his family?" Veronica's laugh was crystalline and cutting. "Is that what we're calling this arrangement? How charming!" The insult hung in the air like poison. Maria felt the familiar weight of being reduced to her function, dismissed as temporary help rather than valued family member. But before she could respond, Richard's voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. "Careful, Veronica. You're talking about people I care about. People you pay to care about you," Veronica corrected smoothly. "There's a difference, though I suppose the lines blur when you're lonely enough." The cruelty was calculated, designed to wound by suggesting that Richard's newfound happiness was purchased rather than genuine. Maria saw the blow land, watched Richard's jaw tighten as old insecurities surfaced. But Alex surprised them all by laughing, a sound without humor but full of recognition. "You know what's funny, Aunt Veronica? You think Dad pays Maria to care about us. But she cared enough to risk her job helping me when I was hurt. She cared enough to save my life when I was too sick to save myself. And she cares enough to tell Dad when he's being stupid, which is something nobody else in this family has ever had the courage to do." "Alex," Richard started, but his son wasn't finished. "You want to know about distractions? Dad was so distracted by trying to live up to your expectations and grandfather's legacy that he almost lost me entirely. Maria helped him find his way back to being human instead of just successful." Veronica's composure cracked slightly. "You're 17, Alex. You don't understand the complexities of what? Family? I understand that Maria's 8-year-old daughter cares more about my diabetes management than you ever have. I understand that her 5-year-old twins include me in their prayers every night. I understand that this house has been more of a home in the past 2 months than it was in the 3 years after Mom died." The truth hit like a physical force. Maria watched Veronica's face cycle through surprise, anger, and something that might have been hurt before settling back into cold control. "Well," Veronica said finally, "I can see you've all become quite attached. But business is business, Richard. The board expects decisions based on shareholder value, not sentiment. Then maybe it's time for new board members," Richard said quietly. "People who understand that the best business decisions consider human impact, not just profit margins." Veronica's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You'd risk everything grandfather built for," she gestured vaguely at Maria, "this domestic fantasy." "I'd risk everything to become the man my wife believed I could be and the father my son deserves," Richard replied. "If that threatens the business, then maybe the business needs to change too." From the kitchen came the sound of laughter, Sophia explaining something to the twins in rapid Spanish, while cookies baked and normalcy continued despite the storm playing out in the foyer. The contrast was stark. Life lived with joy on one side, power wielded with cold calculation on the other. Veronica gathered her composure like armor, straightening her jacket with sharp, efficient movements. "This conversation isn't over," she said, her voice carrying promises of future battles. "Yes, it is," Maria said quietly, stepping forward with calm confidence. "In this house, family comes first. If you can't respect that, you're not welcome at our table." As Veronica left, her heels clicking with frustrated precision, the family stood together in the foyer, bound not by blood or obligation, but by the radical choice to protect and prioritize each other's happiness above all else. 2 years had passed since Veronica's ultimatum, and the transformation was complete in ways that even Maria hadn't dared to imagine. The mansion buzzed with the controlled chaos of a family that had learned to thrive together, Homework scattered across the dining room table, Alex's college acceptance letters proudly displayed on the refrigerator alongside Sophia's honor roll certificates, the twins' soccer cleats muddy by the back door. Maria stood in the university parking lot, her cap and gown billowing in the warm California breeze. At 32, she felt both ancient and newborn, carrying the weight of everything she'd overcome and the lightness of dreams finally realized. Her accounting degree had been earned one night class at a time, studying between dinner preparations and bedtime stories, supported by a family that had made her success their shared mission. "Mummy, you look like a superhero," Carlos announced as the family gathered around her, his gap-toothed grin infectious. "She is a superhero," Miguel corrected with 5-year-old solemnity. "Superheroes help people and make everything better." Sophia, now 10 and dignified beyond her years, straightened Maria's cap with gentle precision. "I'm proud of you, Mommy. You showed us that dreams aren't just for other people." Alex appeared beside them, 19 now, and radiating the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. His acceptance to USC's education program had been cause for celebration that lasted weeks, Richard's pride evident in every conversation about his son's future as an elementary school teacher. "Ready, Professor Gonzalez?" Alex teased, using the title he'd insisted she deserved since her first semester. "Ready?" Maria laughed, though her voice carried the weight of gratitude too deep for casual words. Richard stood slightly apart, watching the family they'd created with an expression that mixed wonder and contentment. The corporate executive still existed within him, but tempered now by priorities that had nothing to do with market share or quarterly projections. He'd learned to measure success in laughter at dinner tables and children's trust rather than boardroom victories. As they walked toward the graduation ceremony, Maria caught sight of other families celebrating their own milestones, parents and children bound by blood and shared history. But their unconventional unit felt no less legitimate, no less permanent. Love, she'd learned, wasn't diminished by being chosen rather than inherited. The ceremony unfolded with traditional pomp and circumstance, but Maria's attention kept drifting to the faces in the audience. Richard had taken the afternoon off, something that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Alex held the twins' hands while Sophia recorded everything on her phone with documentary thoroughness. They'd made her achievement their celebration, their support the foundation that had made this moment possible. When her name was called, Maria walked across the stage with the steady grace of someone who'd traveled an impossible distance to get there. The diploma felt substantial in her hands, but not as substantial as the knowledge that she'd proved to herself and her children that circumstances didn't have to define destinies. The real celebration began afterward, in their backyard, where Richard had insisted on hosting a party that spilled across the manicured lawn with delighted chaos. Neighbors from Maria's old apartment building mixed with Alex's college friends, and even a few business associates who'd learned to appreciate Richard's transformed priorities. The twins raced through sprinklers while Sophia organized elaborate games for younger children, her natural leadership skills making her the center of a small social universe. As evening settled over Los Angeles, fairy lights strung through the garden cast everything in warm gold. Maria found herself standing beside the pool where her children played Marco Polo with Alex and several other teenagers, their laughter echoing off water that reflected 1,000 tiny stars. "Any regrets?" Richard asked, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. Maria considered the question seriously. 2 years earlier, she'd been a fired housekeeper facing an uncertain future. Now she held a degree that had opened doors to opportunities she'd never imagined, surrounded by a family that had chosen to claim her as completely as she'd claimed them. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," she said finally. Richard nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. Their family hadn't been born from traditional circumstances, but it had been built with intentional love. The kind that saw potential where others saw problems, that chose connection over convenience. "What happens next?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested someone content with whatever the answer might be. Maria smiled, watching Sophia explain swimming techniques to Miguel with 8-year-old authority, while Carlos attempted underwater somersaults and Alex provided gentle coaching from the pool's edge. "We keep proving that love is stronger than circumstances and that home isn't a place. It's the people who refuse to give up on you." Across the pool, Alex caught her eye and grinned, giving her a thumbs up that encompassed everything. Her graduation, their family, the future stretching ahead of them like an open road full of possibility. The fairy lights continued to twinkle as night settled completely over their celebration, illuminating faces that had learned to trust in permanence, built from daily choice rather than biological accident. The garden wedding took place on a Saturday in late spring, when jasmine bloomed in clusters along the mansion's back walls and Los Angeles sunshine filtered through leaves like liquid gold. The scene looked like what happiness must look like to people who'd forgotten how to recognize it. "Next," she said, "we keep being family. We keep choosing each other every day." Maria had insisted on simplicity. White chairs arranged on the lawn, wildflowers in mason jars, the kind of celebration that prioritized presence over performance. She stood at the back door in a dress that Sophia had helped choose, something elegant but practical, beautiful but comfortable. At 34, Maria had learned that the best moments in life were the ones where you could be completely yourself, without apology or pretense. "Ready, Mrs. Thompson-to-be?" Alex appeared beside her, impossibly handsome in his role as escort. At 21, he'd grown into someone who understood that strength came from gentleness, that leadership meant service rather than dominance. "Ready," Maria smiled, though the name still felt foreign on her tongue. She'd been Maria Gonzalez for so long that transforming into someone who belonged completely in this beautiful space would take time. The music began. Something simple played on guitar by one of Sophia's friends from the youth orchestra. As they walked down the makeshift aisle together, Maria saw faces that told the story of their unconventional journey. Mrs. Chen, from their old apartment building, sat beside Richard's business partner, who'd learned to value family-friendly policies over pure profit. The twins' soccer coach chatted with Alex's professors, united by their shared affection for a family that had redefined traditional boundaries. Richard waited at the simple arch they'd constructed from garden trellises, his face carrying the same wonder it had worn the day he'd realized that love was not a luxury, but a necessity. Beside him stood Sophia, now 12, and dignified in her role as maid of honor. Her presence a reminder that some families were born from crisis and choice, rather than biology and convenience. The ceremony was brief, personal, focused on promises that had already been tested by time and circumstances. When Richard slipped the ring onto Maria's finger, his hands were steady with certainty rather than trembling with fear. When she spoke her vows, her voice carried the strength of someone who'd learned to demand the love she deserved instead of settling for whatever scraps were offered. "You may kiss your bride," the officiant announced, and the garden erupted in cheers that mixed English and Spanish, formal celebration with joyful chaos. The reception unfolded with the same relaxed warmth that characterized everything this family touched. Miguel and Carlos, now 7 and irrepressible, led a conga line that wound between tables while Sophia documented everything with photographic precision. Alex gave a speech that reduced half the guests to tears and the other half to laughter, talking about Maria's courage and Richard's transformation with the eloquence of someone who'd witnessed miracles disguised as daily kindness. As evening settled over the celebration, Richard found Maria by the pool, where fairy lights reflected like stars on water that had witnessed countless family moments. She changed into comfortable shoes, but still wore her wedding dress, its simple elegance perfect for dancing with children who didn't care about preserving designer fabrics. "Any regrets, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, echoing a question that had become their tradition. Maria considered the journey that had brought them here, from employer and employee to partners in the messy, beautiful work of building family from scratch. She thought of all the moments that had mattered. Alex calling her when he was scared and sick, Richard choosing love over corporate advancement, her children learning that home could expand to include unexpected people who became essential. "Only that we waited so long to make it official," she said, laughing as Carlos cannonballed into the pool, despite explicit instructions to keep his good clothes dry. Richard pulled her close, both of them getting splashed as the twins recruited. Alex for an elaborate water fight that had no rules except joy. This was what happiness looked like, Maria realized. Not perfect moments preserved in photographs, but real life lived with people who chose each other every day. "What happens next?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested someone who'd learned to trust the future rather than control it. Maria smiled, watching Sophia organize the other children into teams for an impromptu pool volleyball game, while Alex served as both referee and comic relief. Their family had been born from the radical decision to prioritize love over convenience, care over profit, presence over performance. "Next," she said, "we keep being family. We keep proving that love multiplies when you share it instead of hoarding it. We keep showing the world that the best things in life aren't things at all." As night settled completely over their wedding celebration, the mansion glowed with warmth that had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with hearts that had learned to choose connection over isolation. In the pool, their children played with the easy confidence of people who knew they were loved without conditions, while on the patio, guests lingered over conversations that mattered more than small talk. The fairy lights continued to twinkle as the last guests departed, leaving behind a family that had been built not from blood or obligation, but from the daily decision to see each other's worth and choose each other's happiness. In the quiet that followed celebration, 5 people who had found each other across impossible circumstances settled into the peace of belonging completely, finally, and forever.